Good evening, everybody. I'm Isla Berman, the Director of Architecture, and it's with great pleasure that I'm able to introduce David Gisson, one of our own architecture faculty, as our lecturer for this evening, and as the curator for the exhibition outside in the nave, Anxious Climate, that is also opening tonight. And there will be a reception after David's lecture out in the nave, as well as a book signing. David Gisson is a historian and theorist of architecture and urbanism, and I might add also a prominent scholar of nature, that is, nature with a small rather than a capital N. In David's recent book, Subnature, Architecture's Other Environments, published by Princeton Architectural Press, he specifically focuses on developing a concept of nature in architectural thought that challenges both the idealized versions of nature presented by classical architectural mythologies — I have some competition upstairs — such as those portrayed by Lauget's primitive hut, as well as more contemporary versions of green architecture's integrated techno-ecological systems that continue to instrumentalize and acculturate nature according to the albeit revised dictums of modern progress. David literally unearths for us that other side of nature, hidden below the sunlight, air, and greenery of Le Corbusier's utopia, the dank, filthy, dusty, and debris-ridden world of mud, smoke, weeds, insects, and pigeons. This sick matter and swarming real nature represents the world of modernism's floating white-walled architectural abstractions were intentionally distanced from, a signifier of the culturally repressed that has now returned to become the focus of more recent experimental practices presented in David's book and in his exhibition. Subnature is a critical contribution to the growing body of scholarship, and certainly a significant topic given that our complex relationship with nature will be one of the most dominant themes leading the future of architectural and urban practices. David is currently an assistant professor of architecture on the CCA faculty and holds a PhD from the University of London and a Master's of Architecture from Yale. He's an editor of the forthcoming issue of AD magazine entitled Territory, and the editor of the book Big and Green: Toward Sustainable Architecture in the 21st Century. David is a prolific writer, and his essays have been included in numerous journals and books, including Log, Volume, Grey Room, AA Files, Constructs, Models and Drawings, Writing Urbanism, and Design Ecologies. He's the recipient of 2 Graham Foundation grants, the Richard Carroll Lectureship at Johns Hopkins University, and most recently, the Chalsty Award at CCA that helped support the completion of this book. Please join me in welcoming David Gisson.
Thank you. Thanks, Al. That was a great introduction and one of the best synopses of the book. In fact, I wish I had written that myself. That was pretty amazing. Thanks for that. I want to thank Isla for being instrumental in bringing the exhibition Anxious Climate to CCA, and I also need to thank a few other people before I share some thoughts with you about the exhibition and this book, Subnature. Andrew Cudless was key in arranging for funding to pay for the shipping of the exhibition from its previous venue at the University of Minneapolis in Minnesota. Thomas Landry coordinated so many different aspects of the exhibition and the evening. I owe him a great deal of gratitude. And Justin Mason, a former student of mine, who helped install the exhibition with me, which was excellent, and made the model bases. And then finally, Isla mentioned the Chalsty Aesthetic and Philosophy Initiative, and the book Subnature really wouldn't be possible without the money they provided to pay for the image rights, which were considerable for a book that had over 125 illustrations. So I'm very grateful that CCA supports this kind of more experimental type of architectural historical work. So this evening I'm going to talk a bit about the exhibition, a little bit more about the book, but I thought I would provide something of an introduction to both by having us all look at this image here. A man looking at smog in LA in 1979. And what I like about this image, which is different than many of the images we see of environmental denigration, and you are all architects, and so you have seen a lot of lectures by environmentalist architects, and I'm sure you've seen a lot of images of environmental denigration. but what I like about this image is that we see someone much like ourselves considering environmental denigration. For me, looking at this image enables me to step back and realize we live at a time in which the reflection upon an environment that appears to be collapsing around us is a large aspect of the consciousness of our particular time. It's one of the key types of thought that I would say circulates in contemporary newspapers, blogs, within lectures as well, within media, this consideration of environmental denigration. The image also lets us step back and consider the unease that many of us experience when we witness these contemporary transformations. I could show you so many more images that you've all seen: melting ice, swimming polar bears, children unfortunately living in trash-strewn environments. We've seen all these things many times. But there's something about this image also that for us in this room who are architects and architectural thinkers and writers presents other challenges. If we imagine this person as an architect, we might consider how he's found himself in a time in which the architectural response to environmental denigration will soon be discussed in virtually every professional and academic setting. In the past 25 years, since the time of this image, we've wondered how our profession should respond to this industrial late modern world. What should we build? How should we build? Or should we build at all? The environmental discussion really reaches into just about everything we think and do these days. Now, one of the key features of contemporary environmental thought is the idea that we've entered a new phase, that this sense, this viewing of this world and our response to it have somehow given us a new type of a new psychology, a new mandate in dealing with late modern industrialization. But I think there's something about this that's not actually true. When we consider the contemporary pressures on the environment, we're really engaging in one of the key features of modern architectural thought. And if I just show you a few historical images, one of the things that I've come to realize is that the reflection on an environment that is in decay and collapse is really one of the key concepts within modern architecture, just as we understand modern architecture and the modern architect. The modern architectural theorist is someone who considers ideas such as space, structure, or form. One of the things that I found in my research is that a modern architect is also someone who considers this type of landscape. And this consideration of environmental denigration, as I think is the best way to describe it, begins with modern industrialization and modern architecture itself. This is an image, a caricature of the smoky Midlands of the English countryside, which were some of the first towns to industrialize in the mid-19th century. And if you look at some of the individuals you think of as key philosophers of a modern architecture, people like Schinkel or Ruskin or Pugin, all of them were thinking about this. What does it mean to work in this context, in this world that's surrounded by smoke, by these types of environmental dangers? And so this was an image that's actually in Subnature of Pegasus above the city by Carl Friedrich Schinkel, the early German modernist architect, very early modern architect. And in 1836, he went on a tour of the English countryside to look at the conditions of industrialization in that country as a type of, in contemporary terms, almost an act of industrial espionage to bring back ideas about factory work and factory production to Germany. And so one of the things that he fell in love with was the modern architecture there. But another thing that he was very troubled by was the transformations he saw in these towns. And he wrote of the grime, the blackened towns, the endless smokestacks that rise above the spires. And he was very troubled by these things, but when he made this image as a type of reflection on his trip, he also drew this image of Pegasus riding, holding an industrially produced object in his left hand. And so it's an ambiguous image. On the one hand, it's an image that talks about the progress of modernity. On the other hand, it's an image that talks about its pollution. Now, an image that's probably much more well-known to many of you in here is by A.W.N. Pugin, his drawing of an industrial town in England. And Pugin also was very troubled by what he saw as of the type of smoke and the industry and the way this was taking over the English Midlands. But he was also troubled by the more general banality of the environment that industrialization and capitalism brought about in the English countryside. So here we not only see factories and smoke, but we also see a panopticon prison and this decaying Gothic church that is dear to his heart. Now, Pugin was a devout Catholic. He was also something of an anti-capitalist, and he was most definitely against industrialization. And in this drawing, this contrast that he made, he thought rather than this modern world here, he wanted to go back to this pre-modern world here, a world of medieval life, of pre-industry, a world of community and agrarian sentiments. And so, while this image might seem a bit distant to us, many of the ideas within this image carry through hundreds of years later into ideas that Frank Lloyd Wright developed in terms of considering an escape from industry and a return to some type of organic totality that was out of the cities that he too thought were vile, both in terms of their culture and in terms of their atmosphere. And very much, I think, some of these pre-modern sentiments continue to the present. Now, when we talk about the present and we talk about this type of contrast, we have new types of contrasts in our age. And this is an image by William McDonough, a contemporary architect, that's no less of a contrast than Pugin's. But where Pugin wanted to go back to medieval life, William McDonough wants us to go back to nature itself. And so this is an image that imagine someone in his office or an illustrator was commissioned to produce, that details his plans for the expansion and renovation of the Ford River Rouge complex in Dearborn, Michigan. It's one of the largest, if not the largest, industrial facility in the world. And so here we see an image in which factories become covered with greenery, in which windmills and solar cells are actively generating energy. William McDonough speaks about how the plants at this factory will clean the air, will clean the soil. This is a world in which pollution itself is no more, right? This is a world in which pollution has been replaced by nature. And if you notice this image, there's also some very other subtle things about this. Now, the works of industry and its factories are nestled within the heart of nature itself. It's the surroundings of this factory are represented in very sylvan and Edenic qualities. Now, this project is something of a masterwork, a masterpiece, one might argue, of green thought and green design. It is. In fact, its concepts and its technologies are really inarguably decent, okay, in the sense that who can argue against a vision like this, all right? And my point tonight is not to tear this down and say that green architecture is bad. That's not the point here. There are things here that I think are a bit beyond debate in terms of certain types of technologies and certain type of desires. But what I do think, and I have thought about a lot, having written about work like this 7 or 8 years ago in projects such as Big and Green, what I do think is how can we exceed this? And also, more importantly, in light of the historical examples that I gave you, how can we make work that acknowledges the fact that the reflection itself on environmental collapse is a key feature of our age? How can that be built into architecture? Some of the things that I wonder about when looking at this image and trying to exceed it, can we incorporate the concepts of more natural architecture into something we might term a more critical and self-reflective architecture? In other words, how can we do what this project does? How can we remediate environmental denigration while understanding the historical and contemporary complexities of our own efforts and of the sites within we work? And then, so ultimately, what I hope for is how can we develop an architectural theory that acknowledges one of the key features of our consciousness as modern subjects, that we think and we ponder about environmental collapse. And if I was to sum up the two projects that I want to describe to you tonight, Anxious Climate and Subnature, I would think that's it, that I'm looking for a theory or an approach in which the architect acknowledges that this is something we do as modern people, that we think, particularly in our age, that we think about an environment that appears to be out of control, and how do we engage with people at that mental level. I really appreciate McDonough's work, but I would argue where he engages with us metabolically. He wants to clean the air, he wants to clean our soil, right? How can we engage through environmentalism with people as intellectual subjects as well? So, two projects that I'll talk about this evening, Anxious Climate and Subnature, begin to provide some frameworks within which we might consider these possibilities. Now, I'm not going to be bombastic and say that these are the answers to these issues, because these are huge problems and huge issues. But I think there's something that I see in the contemporary work in Anxious Climate, and there's something about the historical project of Subnature and some of its contemporary work that offers some clues and some possibilities. Now, this exhibition I curated in 2005 while I was teaching at Penn State University. And what I was interested in was gathering some architects I thought were doing very interesting critical work on the environment. 09 from Madrid, Philippe Ram from Lausanne and Paris, and Aaron Saïd, in French pronounced Ercy, from Paris, who are all doing very unusual work with nature, working with nature in unusual ways, but also offered some possibilities that seemed outside the frameworks of what we consider green design. Now, all of them deal with the environment with a great deal of complexity, and I'll show you just 2 or 3 projects to give you some sense of their approach, and of course it's all outside, so there's no reason to get into it too much in depth. This is a project for Ames, Iowa by the firm 09 called the Magic Mountain. Now, what is this project? In 2004, they entered a competition to create a facade for a power plant in Ames, Iowa, a large power plant facility, not unlike the kind of building that we saw at River Rouge, okay? And so they're asked to make some type of facade for it to help bring this thing into the character of the town, which is probably something of an impossible task. So rather than develop a facade that would somehow mask the plant or mitigate the plant visually, so to speak, they decided to bring nature into this power plant, but nature in such a way that makes us think about what pollution is, what nature is, and their ambiguity in our day and age. Let's be honest, that nature is something that can heal in the sense of that image of River Rouge, but we live in an era in which we have to deal with things like algae blooms and other forms of nature that appear as pollutants themselves. So nature's role as the good is not entirely clear. So in their proposal, they developed this wire mesh mass as the maquette of the project, in which they proposed to gather up the entire facade of wire mesh that would surround the power plant, a series of weeds and honeysuckle rose plants that would climb up the entire facility, be watered through an irrigation system, and would in a sense turn this monstrosity, this power plant in the city, into another kind of monstrosity, but a monstrosity that was a natural monstrosity, okay? And so they imagine this thing, in a sense, as it grows and as it flowers, that it will scatter pollution in the surrounding townscape. And in a sense, it replaces the pollution of smoke with the pollution of nature. But this is a pollution that smells good. It's beautiful. And we'll watch flowers, roses, insects, birds, but it makes us question what pollution is in our time. It's a difficult project, and one imagines, of course, if this would be built, that, well, it would be quite controversial, of course. Anyway, but interesting nonetheless, and really makes me question these lines between nature and something we might term pollution. Now, a somewhat more disturbing, but I think equally thoughtful project, if you can really see what's afoot in it, is the BMU or Tower, or the Dusty Relief Tower by Arend Saïd in Bangkok, Thailand. Now, I know several of you in this room know this project, but I'd like to explain it in a way that I think might be a little different than how you've heard explained before. This is a proposal for an art gallery, cafe, I think a 4 or 5 story building. I have to look at the slides to be quite sure. But in their proposal, they made this building in the polluted context of downtown Bangkok, Thailand, and they proposed to make a building that will draw the pollution of Bangkok to the skin of the building, drawing attention to the building, and in a sense turning this thing into another kind of monster. A building that is completely coated with pollution, but which in the interiors of the building are completely pollution-free. And so here you see a section of the building. These are the galleries. This is a study model. One doubts that it would really look like Cousin It from the Addams Family. But here you can see the building here. So the tower protects the inhabitants, but it draws pollution into the exterior of the building, right? Now, ostensibly, this building cleans the air of Bangkok because it's drawing pollution to the outside. It is, in effect, partially cleaning the air of Bangkok, and the architects, Ercy, acknowledge as much. But I think what this building is really all about, this art gallery in this polluted context, I think it enables us to understand how museums spaces, how office towers, how shopping malls in these kinds of cities offer ironic means of protection from their surrounding environments. They have a curious role in a polluted context. And when we look at an image like this, of this Western woman in this art gallery, gazing out of this window at this pollution. I thought, this is a very disturbing image, right? And I thought, why is this image in Bangkok filled with, in his renderings, why is it always filled with these Westerners? And I thought, maybe it enables us to consider the irony of going to look at art in Bangkok, and the extremely environmentally controlled and modulated and monitored environment of a space of an art gallery within a city that has such horrible pollution. It makes us understand the very ironies of calling this program, this type of building, into being in this site. And so it makes us think. And so also, what I like about this image, if we think back to the very first image I showed you, it also talks about how that concept of reflection, of consideration of environmental collapse can be built into architecture, even as we engage an architecture that attempts to deal with that environmental collapse on a technical level. Now, the last project from Anxious Climate that I want to show you is a project that I just brought into the exhibition for this showing of the exhibition. This is a very funny exhibition. It was curated in 2005, but every time this exhibition goes to a school to be exhibited, it always seems to be taking on new work. Either people email me, the architects ask if they can show a project, the school that's showing it wants to show a project. So it's kind of a fun exhibition that way. It has it's taking on a life of its own, and I'm sure as it travels to the next place, it'll have ever more work. So in this project, with somewhat pretentious name, Deterritorialized Territory, Philippe Ram proposes to make a room that comments on the production of a pre-modern world, okay, a world before industry. So his idea is that within the early 20th century, these are clips from a movie, so I have to apologize for the resolution. And by the way, the movie is outside. So his argument is that in the early 20th century, in Paris, one could roughly understand the environment outside of a room, let's say a flat in an apartment building in Paris. One could roughly understand that air to be natural. That is, it has sky, it has sun, etc. It hasn't been completely carbonized like the air it is today. One could understand the interior of that room to be artificial, in the sense that it would be heated. 30 years later, it would be air conditioned. Okay, it would be lit, electrically lit or gas lit. But he says, today, in an era of Chernobyl, of CO2, this is very cheery stuff, I realize, that we need to understand that the space outside of the buildings in Paris, or really anywhere, are artificial as well. The air has become a completely human construct, right? The air inside the building has become a completely human construct. So in his proposal, he argues, what if I make the interior of the building natural? How could I do that? Is that even possible? Well, technically, it's impossible from a strictly philosophical point of view, because he's still going to be engaged in some form of producing the air, of design, of human generation of the air inside. But nonetheless, his idea is to make inside this room the atmosphere of a late May day in Paris in 1832. And here, sort of crummy illustrations, but I just want to explain some of the ideas. His idea is not to fill this room with sentimental imagery from Paris from 1832, late May day in Paris, 1832. I'll explain the importance of that date in just a minute. His idea is to fill the atmosphere. The atmosphere is historical, but the space is filled with rather modern features of design. He has these chairs so you can experience the different smells that would be at the different heights of a room during that age. He has very highly sophisticated passive cooling and heating equipment in this room. And then he has this curious device here, which will reproduce the smell of wafting wood from the forest that once existed outside of Paris, the winds that have been changed because of the adjustments to the surrounding nature. And so why Paris? Why May? Why 1832? There's something very sad and monumental about this project. Because the day after this room is created, the first first coal-fired plant in Paris will be fired. So in late May in 1832, the first coal factory was built in Paris. And so it's a world before the burning of coal in Paris. And there's something, it's a monument, which is something that I think is really quite tremendous about this project. It's a monumental atmosphere that makes us think about the past and the future that unfortunately cannot so easily be regained. So what I ultimately saw in these projects was this type of critical reflection that I was always craving. One of my I don't really have time to explain the Big and Green project, but it was long ago, and some of you may know it. But it was basically an overview of sustainable and green skyscrapers and large-scale buildings. And one of the things that was so frustrating about that project was that there was so little type of critical architecture engaged with that subject. And so I remember talking to a former professor of mine, and I said, do you ever think we could have a critical environmental architecture? It's like 8 years ago. He said, no, it's not possible. It's not possible. But I don't think that's true. And having seen these projects, I think there is some hope for that. So subnature continues many of the ideas with an anxious climate, but it engages more deeply with excavating the architectural, contemporary architectural exploration of corrupted environments in particular. And it also offers, unlike an exhibition, it offers a historical and theoretical type of commentary as well. Now, the book, which was just published last week, examines many of the ways architects have identified, visualized, and contended with the matter, or the ideas circulating around the matter that constitutes denigrated architectural environments. So my argument is that matter enters the category of the subnatural when it's envisioned as potentially threatening to the inhabitants or to the material formations or ideas that constitutes architecture. So subnature is both a thing, and it's both a thing and it's attitudes attached to a thing. Subnatures are those forms of nature, roughly speaking, or socio-nature, hybrid nature, that are deemed filthy, fearsome, uncontrollable, or primitive. So this is a image. This actually is quite interesting where this is taken from. Sorry, it's not on the caption. It's in New York City in 1953, but they're standing at the observation tower of Rockefeller Center, looking at the smog and smoke and the view of the city at that time. So the book traces the history of 12 ever-present subnatures within architectural thought. It begins with atmospheres, such as dankness, which I'll talk about a little bit more at length, smoke, gas, and exhaust. This is one thing I should mention about the book. The book is not a technical book. It's not going to show you how to make a smoke-free environment. The book is, I don't mean to laugh, I'm not diminishing the importance of but the book is about engaging with the visual life of these forms, these subnatural forms in the history of our discipline. And so this is really fascinating image of the Reliance Building in Chicago by Daniel Burnham. It was taken just 13 years after the building was built. This was an all-white terracotta, vitreous, skinned building that was supposed to be resistant to what the architect called the vile soup of Chicago. And here it is completely blackened by the soot. Nevertheless, it can be clean, but it shows how skyscrapers were envisioned as somewhat resistant to their environments. The second section of this book examines subnatural forms of matter, such as puddles, mud, dust, and debris. And this is this image also was really taken with, this is a really fun book to it's a great project to undertake. This is actually from an architectural history book, a book that probably some of you in the room read when you were architecture students, but nobody really reads as much anymore, Leonardo Benevelo's History of Architecture. And so one of the things that he did in this book, which I think is really great, is that he went to many of the sites of the modern masters of their work, such as this Master's House in Bauhaus, at the Bauhaus in Dessau, and he rephotographed the buildings as they are now versus how they're represented when they were built. And so what he discovered was the way that they're sort of lost in the mental lives of their current communities, but also the way that they're overrun with weeds and puddles. And his point was not to say that modern architecture was bad, but he wanted to show how these modern buildings had a certain kind of relationship to their surroundings, and also provide a certain kind of realism, so that what's interesting about showing them as a state of decay is they actually are very fresh in our minds as objects versus this frozen architectural image with a perfect sky from, let's say, the late 20s or early 30s. There's many contemporary projects in the book, and just to fast forward, to move forward quite quickly, but that are no less dealing with representational issues. The final section of the book, which I think is in some ways was the most complicated for me, examines things that are regarded as subnatural life, various urban but also agricultural nuisances and pests, such as weeds, insects, pigeons. And so this is, actually the pigeons were quite interesting in the end. This is a image from Miranda Lash, which is often seen, this image of a swarming, peeling, flying map of pigeons in the city is a very, I think, I don't know if the word important quite captures it because they're such young architects, but is an influential image in a lot of generative and vitalist contemporary architectural forms of thinking. What I also think is important to see in some of Aranda Lash's early projects is their constant engagement with forms of nature that are somewhat lesser or denigrated. And so here they're capturing the pigeons as something that might be a serious object of study, but also commenting on their ubiquity in the city and marveling at their beautiful patterns. And if you look at the book, you realize this is a complete trope of modernism. The architects and artists are completely fascinated by pigeons in cities because they represent a completely free and cosmopolitan nature. They're not eaten, they're not put to use, they're just expression of life. One of the very last chapter deals with the crowds and the ways that various architects, engineers, and architectural thinkers have envisioned the exhalations, to use the 19th century words, of crowds as potentially threatening. And so I've looked at so many images of pictures of people, just bizarre images of people trying to draw what comes of our mouths as we breathe from the 19th century. Some really fascinating but creepy stuff. This is by Omar Khan, who this is his open columns project that he imagines for a sort of crowded hall, in which he's continuing this tradition, I would say, and he's playing with these swirls of carbon dioxide that he's imagined are created by aggregations of people, and trying to pull people in such a way that he can diminish these things. Here's the table of contents, and if you asked me 5 years ago if I would ever write a table of contents with pigeons, weeds, dust, and puddles in it, I would have thought you were nuts. We're just looking at this the other day and thinking this looks like a failed building inspector's report, right? Which, of course, is the point. And so each of the chapters provides a history of the complex ways architecture engages with these things, both physically and as ideas. Each chapter concludes with an overview of how these things appear in the most contemporary work. And again, the book is illustrated to give you a sense of the visual life of these things in our discipline. And so I thought, just with the time that I have, I would introduce you just to a few of the ideas in the chapters. I'm looking, it's 7:45. Maybe I'll just show you one of the chapters, which was really enjoyable to research. This is the first image from a chapter on dankness. Okay, now, why dankness? And this is also the very first chapter in the book. One second. If you read, if you're a student, like I and many of my colleagues are, of architectural theory, you realize that dankness is sort of the primordial pollutant, okay? If you read Logier, well, I don't need to recite the names, okay. But if you read a variety of early modern architectural thought, there's a great deal of reflection on how caves and the environment of caves, particularly their dankness, their cold or tepid, dark, humid environments, are somehow an inferior atmosphere that architecture will replace. That building activity itself will bring society out of its given means of habitation, caves, and provide a more suitable atmosphere for human society and life. Okay? Now, you can see this in so many different forms of writing. It's a denigrated form of environment. Now, what's interesting about this image by Philibert Delorme, a early French classical architect, is that he makes an allegory of the cave as both a kind of nature that, or a sub-nature that one must emerge out of to have architecture, but also that architecture is a profession itself that involves leaving the cave. This has obvious roots in certain kinds of Platonic thought. But what does the architect go towards? The architect leaves the denigrated atmosphere of the cave for the palm of knowledge, okay? And so here in his writing, caves, like many of the other classical authors, are something, the given means of inhabitation, that architecture as a built construct that's obviously not a cave, that's physically made by people, will offer some respite from, but also here it's an allegorical thing. Now what's curious about this is that Philibert Delorme was working at a time in which architects and what we might call early forms of urbanists were being asked to reconsider the cave-like undergrounds of European cities. And he was operating in Paris. This is an image of an Italian sewer, but he was operating in Paris. And one of the things Philibert Delorme was asked to do, which was sort of should be on Dirtiest Jobs on TV, he was asked to explore the sewers of Paris by the French King Henry II. Okay, this was one of the first sort of modern explorations of the sewers to figure out a way to rationalize them. And there's a great passage in Victor Hugo's Les Miserables when he fictionalizes what this must have been like for Delorme. And he writes about the disgusting nature and the slime and how they went forward 300 yards but were repulsed by the disgust and had to leave the sewers, the job undone. And so many years later, architects began to explore the sewers and to figure out a way to rationalize them, which in this context means to mitigate their dank atmosphere. And so this is one of, well, it is in fact the first street section showing houses, a sewer, wastewater going from houses into sewers. It's a rather famous image from architectural thought. But it also shows how the undergrounds of cities were being rationalized and how dankness, always present, was somehow architects were attempting to try to figure out a way to mitigate it, to engage with the city with a more healthful future. And so here, just to point out a few things, here you see the sewer. Obviously this image is about types of urban flow with its curved streets. It's open to let air and light into the sewer space. Of course, all of this will actually be realized when Georges Haussmann and his crews will completely rebuild both the underground and above ground of Paris. And to this day, you can tour the sewers of Paris and see the work that was done to rationalize these things, to bring light and air to these dank spaces. And so within architectural thought proper, we also see another kind of rationalization of the underground. This is a section, two sections, a cartoon, as it is, that was drawn by Le Corbusier, which shows a traditional masonry construction system and his modern concrete structural system here. And one of the things he wrote about was the mediocrity of the spaces of traditional forms of construction, both in Paris and the countryside. And in particular, he said the basement. The basement is the most mediocre of spaces with its atmosphere. So there's all this talk. It's wet, it's cold, it's dark. And so he replaces these things with open vegetation, open air, vegetation on the roof, light and air, and he says quite proudly, with my construction system, I leave the ground intact, so not to touch architecture. And so, of course, we know that modernity brought us, in architecture, brings us all these wonderful concepts and spatial ideas and ideas about form and structure, etc. But we also have to acknowledge that modernity also has, in some cases, resulted in a banalization of the environment itself. And so, within post-war architectural thought and even spatial philosophy, Gaston Bachelard and his Poetics of Space book comes to mind. There's, in a sense, a kind of recovery of this underground space. How can we rethink what we've lost with modernity? We've lost some things. We lose a certain sense of tradition and community, but there's certain kinds of atmospheres that get lost with the rationalization of buildings. How can we bring dankness back? As if that is a project in itself, okay? And if you've read the Poetics of Space, which is one of those books I don't think we give to students anymore, it actually has some terrific chapters that talk about the atmosphere of basements and how interesting they are. So one of the architects who was in Anxious Climate, who's working with this and trying to recover this dankness as both a thing that's an experience that's lost and as a historical entity, is Philippe Rome. These are his underground houses that are designed for a French countryside about 60 miles south of Paris, 100 miles south of Paris, in Vassivière. And what he proposes is what he calls, this is his quote, a building that is in profound relationship to its soil. And so what he proposes is nestling a small single-family house into the earth. He designed like 12 or 15 of these for the site, in which there's a large underground chamber, in which the entire house is almost basement, okay? And he says he opens up this strange new zone in the house. And so he imagines taking this space, this earth, and he says this earthy taste that will be in your mouth, and bringing it into the rooms of the home, right? So it's, if you've ever been in a country house, you've probably experienced these things. And so it's both a project that, if I need to mention that, is about a certain kind of passive cooling, okay, passive ventilation, but that's not what's important here. The important here is the kind of historical recovery he's trying to engage with this project. Here you see this atmospheric image of these things set along the countryside. Here you see a technical diagram explaining how these space could be warmed or cooled and the way the air flows through it. And then here in this image that I think is really interesting, we see this underground space itself as a kind of experience that's been brought back. Now, in the interest of time, because I do want to get out there at 8 o'clock when our empanadas and appetizers arrive, okay? Maybe I'll skip forward a bit and just explain to you, and sort of wrap this up a bit, explain to you the cover of the book itself, and go back to this idea of reflection. Now, this is the image that was used for the cover of the book. What is this, right? This strange, creepy-looking stuff, okay? This is from a project by Jorge Otero Pelos called The Ethics of Dust, that was done in Bolzano, Italy. And I'll explain what this is. Some of you who in this room know this project, but many of you probably don't. So in 2008, Jorge was asked to clean the interior of this factory in Bolzano, Italy, so that it could be used for the staging of art. All right? And so this is an old factory space, like River Rouge, except it's not in operation. It's being turned into a sort of space for a post-industrial economy. And so he was asked to clean this space. So he proposed to clean this space, but to bring the dust into a new type of life of its own. And so one of the things that I really love about this project was that Jorge was inspired by the idea for this project by reading John Ruskin. And John Ruskin wrote that as much as Ruskin hated the kind of industrialization that was happening in the Midlands of England, he really hated the idea of cleaning buildings. Okay, so here's someone who's railing against smoke, like Pugin or Schinkel. Okay? He hates the smoky environment, but he thinks to remove it, to completely erase it, is to deny the history of the things that happened there, which is a pretty tremendous thought for the mid-19th century. So Jorge used this this technique that's used in historical preservation, in which latex is painted on the surface of walls and then it's ripped off. It's like a really bad bikini waxing or something of a building. And so generally these things are thrown away, okay? And so instead he decides to hang them on the very scaffold himself that he was using to do the cleaning, and so that people will come, look at this pollution, and think about the past of this space. And what I think is pretty great about this project is that many people, many urban thinkers write about and lament the loss of industrial spaces to post-industrialization. We're losing memories, we lose history, we are losing work, okay? And what I think is great about this space is that he makes you think about the very labor that used to occur in this space, where art is being hung, and he makes you think that people worked there. And this was a space that had a certain kind of environment, an atmosphere, environment of industry that he's maintained to keep. And so it was really great to, and very consciously, thought to put that on the cover of the book, because I think that really sums up the concepts of this book and what it's all about. So how do we retain this stuff? How do we reflect on it? But how do we do so in a way that's not ridiculous and irresponsible, right? It's not about like some kind of post-apocalyptic vision of the world. It's about engaging in things like cleaning, like remediation, but it's about maintaining the history of these things as we go about that effort. So anyway, that gives you a snapshot of the book and the exhibition. And so I think Isla also wanted me to mention before we do a few questions that we're going to have, to remind you, that we'll have some food served outside, an exhibition opening, and book signings. And so thank you very much. Yeah.